You cannot full wool without water. Duke Edward Blackwood said it while pressing the silver tip of his cane into the dry white chalk beneath Victoria Vance's feet. Then he handed her the deed to a broken windmill on the windiest hill in Sussex, and barred her from the river that had powered her father's trade. He expected her to fail before winter, and he had chosen his timing carefully. In 4 weeks, the Coastguard would award its winter cloth contract, while men along the freezing coast were already wearing wool coats that turned heavy with rain and let the sea wind cut straight through them. Victoria had 3 pounds, torn sails, worn gears, greasy wool, and almost no water. Her first attempt failed exactly as Blackwood expected. But inside the abandoned mill, one wooden hammer still lifted when she forced the old mechanism by hand. And beneath the useless chalk hill, Victoria found something that should not have been there. If she understood both clues correctly, Blackwood had not given her a graveyard. He had given her the one mill his river could never control. The wind tore at the broken sails of White Vale Windmill hard enough to make the whole oak tower groan. Duke Edward Blackwood planted the silver tip of his cane into the white chalk at Victoria Vance's feet. Dust jumped around his polished boots. Behind him waited 2 carriages, 3 estate men, and the solicitor who had brought the deed. No river, Blackwood said. No mill pond, not even a proper well. He held out the folded document. Victoria took it without lowering her eyes. 4 days earlier, his men had locked the gates of her father's fulling mill beside the river. Blackwood controlled the water rights, the road beside it, and most of the wool contracts worth having in the county. Now he had given her White Vale, a ruined chalk mill on a ridge where the wind never seemed to stop. The Coastguard closes its winter cloth bidding in 4 weeks, he added. You may consider this your opportunity. One of the estate men smiled. Victoria looked past them toward the tower. The canvas on the eastern sail hung in strips. 2 teeth were missing from the great brake wheel. Rust stained the iron straps around the main shaft. Through the lower doorway she could see the old fulling stocks, 2 enormous wooden hammers, standing motionless in their frame. Blackwood followed her gaze. You cannot full wool without water. He turned before she answered. The carriages rolled downhill, leaving Victoria with 3 pounds in her purse, several greasy lengths of loose-woven wool under a canvas sheet, and a deed to a machine everyone else considered useless. Only when the last carriage disappeared did she enter. The mill smelled of chalk, old timber, mouse droppings, and stale lanolin trapped in the floorboards from work done years before. Victoria set down the deed and pressed both hands against the nearest stock. The oak face was scarred but sound. She checked the lifting arm next. Worn, not broken. Above it, the camshaft sat under a skin of dust. One bearing had sagged. Several gear teeth were badly rounded, but the shaft itself had not split. Victoria climbed onto the lower framing, braced one boot against a beam, and forced the mechanism backward a few inches. The stock rose, then dropped. Clack. She stopped. That sound was familiar. Not the hollow knock of rotten timber, not the grind of a seized bearing. A working engagement. Victoria wiped chalk from the cam with her thumb and looked up toward the torn sails moving restlessly against the gray sky. Blackwood had taken away her river because he believed water was the only thing that could lift a fuller's hammer. But if White Vale's stocks could still rise, what else had he failed to understand? By noon, Victoria had stopped thinking of White Vale as one broken machine. It was 3 different problems. The sails could catch wind, but only if she replaced enough canvas to balance them. The gearing could still transfer force, but 2 missing teeth and 1 loose bearing would destroy the wheel if she let it run at full speed. The stocks themselves were sound, yet useless, until the shaft could lift them safely. She marked the damaged teeth with charcoal and tied a length of cord around the main axle to measure its sideways movement. Planning to hang it? The voice came from the doorway. A broad-shouldered young shepherd stood outside with a crook in one hand and rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. 2 sheep waited behind him, as if they had brought him there. Measuring the play in the shaft, Victoria said. He looked at the cord, then at the wheel. Thomas Hale, Victoria Vance. I know. That was all he said about her name. Thomas had come because his flock often sheltered behind the mill when the wind crossed the ridge. He stayed because Victoria needed someone to hold the ladder while she climbed to inspect the upper bearing. The bronze sleeve had worn oval, badly, but not beyond packing and adjustment. "Can it run?" Thomas called. "Once." He frowned. "If I start it now, it may run once." That answer earned his attention. For the next hour, Victoria separated what could be repaired from what had to be replaced. A cracked pin could be forged later. 2 gear teeth needed new hardwood. 1 sail arm was warped but still strong enough to carry reduced canvas. She refused to move the main brake until the load was balanced. Thomas watched her make 3 different charcoal marks on the wheel. "What do those mean?" "Replace. Repair. Leave alone until I know what it's carrying." He nodded once. Outside, the wind had driven a thin shower across the eastern side of the hill. Thomas pointed toward a shallow cut in the ground where the chalk turned darker. "That patch always goes strange after rain," he said. "Slippery. Sheep hate stepping in it." Victoria crouched and pushed 2 fingers beneath the white surface. The material below was finer than chalk, pale gray, soft enough to smear across her skin. She rubbed it between finger and thumb. It did not feel like ordinary mud. She scraped a handful into a scrap of cloth and tied it shut. Only then did she count the money in her purse again. 3 pounds. Enough canvas to make the sails useful, or enough hardwood to repair the wheel properly. Not both. Victoria looked from the torn sails to the marked gear teeth. White Vale still had more life in it than Blackwood knew. The question was, which part she could afford to save first. Victoria spent the first pound on nothing. That was the decision. Canvas would make the sails move. Hardwood would make the gearing safer. She could not afford both, and repairing half a machine would still leave her without clean cloth to sell. So she tried the oldest method first. Thomas found her the next morning beside 2 rain barrels, sleeves rolled above the elbow, a length of greasy wool spread across a low wooden board. "You're going to tread it?" "I'm going to find out whether I have to rebuild the mill before I can earn enough to rebuild the mill." They warmed rainwater over a small fire, worked ordinary chalk mud into the wool, then folded the cloth into a shallow tub. Victoria stepped in barefoot and began pressing, turning, and kneading it under her heels. By afternoon, her calves burned. By evening, the water had turned gray, but the wool still felt slick. The next day, she tried again. Her father had taught her never to trust appearance alone. Grease could leave the surface and remain deep in the yarn. He had shown her how to pinch a wet fold between finger and thumb, then pull it apart slowly. Properly scoured wool resisted differently. Properly fulled cloth lost openness as the fibers locked tighter under moisture, heat, and pressure. This cloth did neither. Thomas lifted one corner. It looked smaller, unevenly. A section near the edge had tightened too much. Another remained loose enough for daylight to show through. 2 small holes had opened, where the fabric had twisted underfoot. Worse, the smell of stale lanolin remained. Victoria sat back on the cold ground. 2 days gone, most of the rainwater gone. 1 length of wool nearly ruined. Thomas did not offer comfort. He only asked, "What now?" Victoria carried the cloth outside and spread it beside the mill to dry. The wind caught one edge and dragged it several feet before she trapped it with a stone. A corner fell across the pale soil she had collected from the eastern cut. She left it there overnight. At dawn, the mud on most of the cloth had dried into a useless crust. But the corner, lying in the finer gray earth, looked different. Victoria rubbed it between her fingers. The greasy shine had faded. She folded that corner against an untreated section and pressed both against her thumb. One slipped. The other did not. Thomas crouched beside her. "What did you do to it?" Victoria looked toward the eastern slope. "Nothing." Then she stood and picked up a shovel. "That's why I need to know what the hill did." The pale soil came out of the eastern slope in a narrow seam beneath the chalk. Victoria dug only enough for a test. She spread the material on a board inside the mill, let the wind dry it, then crushed the lumps with a wooden mallet and pushed the powder through coarse cloth. When she worked a handful into greasy fleece with a few spoonfuls of warm rainwater, the clay darkened almost at once. Thomas stared at it. "It's drinking the grease." absorbing it. Victoria pressed the wool between her fingers. The slickness had weakened. Her father had bought earth like this in small quantities when ordinary washing failed. He had never treated it as magic. It still had to be distributed evenly, worked into the wool, then removed. Too much would leave grit behind. Too little would waste the labor. Victoria looked toward the silent stalks. Foot pressure had failed because it was weak and uneven. The mill could solve that, but only if she could make it turn. She spent part of the remaining money on canvas and kept enough for nails, cord, and food. That left nothing for proper replacement gear teeth. Thomas disappeared for an hour and returned, dragging 2 lengths of old hornbeam. "Blackwood's men pulled down our boundary fence last spring," he said. "I kept these." The wood was weathered outside but hard at the center. Victoria tested it with a knife, then began shaping teeth. They worked until their hands cramped. Thomas held the stock while she cut shoulders into the hornbeam. Victoria fitted each piece separately, shaving away fractions until the repaired teeth met the next wheel without binding. The sails were worse. Instead of covering them fully, she patched only enough canvas to catch useful wind. She left reefing lines within reach so she could reduce the exposed area before a gust drove the mill beyond control. At the camshaft, she changed the timing so the 2 heavy stalks would not fall together, 1 hammer at a time. Less shock through the frame. By late afternoon, White Vale no longer looked repaired. It looked dangerous in a more promising way. Victoria carried the first sack of sifted earth beside the fulling bed, then climbed to the brake lever. Thomas stood clear. The sails shuddered as the wind caught them. The great wheel moved half a tooth, stopped, then moved again. Victoria listened to the gear engagement, tightened her grip, and eased the brake farther open. Above them, the shaft began to turn. 1 wooden stock rose slowly from its bed. For the first time in years, White Vale was preparing to strike. The first proper run nearly ruined the wool. Victoria had loaded a narrow length into the fulling bed with damp. Fuller's earth worked through the fibers. For several minutes, the stalks rose and fell cleanly. Then the wind strengthened. The beat quickened. Thud, thud, thud. Too fast. The cloth began to bunch beneath 1 hammer. Victoria saw the fold tighten before Thomas did. "Break." He pulled. She reached into the bed only after the stalks stopped completely. 1 edge had stretched crooked, and the center had begun to crease against itself. Another minute would have torn it. Victoria said nothing while she unfolded the cloth. She climbed back to the sail controls and reduced the exposed canvas. Then she altered the regulating peg on the drive, so the shaft could not accelerate as easily under a sudden gust. When they started again, she listened instead of watching. The new rhythm was slower, heavy, even. She ran the second piece in short intervals, stopping to turn the cloth and measure it against a cord marked with its original length. Each time, she checked the surface with her fingers before allowing another cycle. The wool changed gradually. The loose gaps between threads narrowed. The surface grew smoother. The greasy drag beneath her thumb weakened as the clay worked deeper into the cloth. When the piece had shortened by nearly a third, Victoria stopped. "That much?" Thomas asked. "That is the point." They used the last clean rainwater for a careful rinse, not a soaking. By evening, the cloth hung near the mill wall, dense and surprisingly smooth. Thomas held it toward the light. Almost none passed through. Victoria cut enough for a plain shepherd's cloak. The next morning, Thomas wore it onto the downs beneath a sky already dark with rain. He returned after nightfall with water running from his hat and boots. The cloak was wet across the shoulders, but when he opened it, his shirt beneath was dry except at the collar. Thomas touched the inside lining twice, as if expecting the result to disappear. 2 Coastguard men had sheltered with him near the cliffs that afternoon. They had seen the rain strike the new cloth and watched it stay firm instead of collapsing into a heavy, sodden layer. The following day, both men came to White Vale. One examined the cloak. The other asked the price. Then he said, "Can you make 5 more?" Victoria looked at the turning sails above them. For the first time, White Vale had produced something another man was willing to pay for. And somewhere below the hill, word had begun moving toward Blackwood. 5 cloaks were not a large order. At White Vale, they were almost too large. Victoria could full the cloth, but she could not dig clay, dry it, grind it, rinse finished wool, cut patterns, and sew every seam before the Coastguard wanted delivery. So she stopped treating the mill like a private workshop. Thomas brought 2 women from the village, Martha Pike and Elsie Reed, both accustomed to mending shepherds' coats for pennies. Victoria paid them by the day from the Coastguard deposit and showed them exactly where speed mattered and where it did not. The clay demanded the same discipline. They dug only from the narrow, pale seam beneath the chalk. Victoria rejected loads mixed with too much surface soil, spread the usable earth on boards to dry, then crushed it under an old millstone before sifting it through coarse cloth. Too much clay left the wool harsh. Too little left grease behind. She began weighing each batch. The mill followed its own schedule. Cloth went into the stocks damp, never soaked. The hammers worked in timed intervals. Between runs, Victoria stopped the shaft, unfolded the wool, measured shrinkage, and checked whether the fibers were closing evenly. By the 3rd cloak, the process could be repeated without guessing. That mattered more to her than the first success. One afternoon, a Coastguard petty officer climbed the hill, carrying the cloak Thomas had worn during the storm. Salt had dried pale along the shoulders. "We took it along the cliffs for 3 watches," he said. "It stayed heavy enough to cut the wind, but it did not drink half the weather like the issue coats." Victoria examined the inside herself. The cloth had softened with wear, the seams held. There was no tearing where the shoulders had taken the worst strain. "Would you trust 5 men in these?" The officer looked toward the row hanging beneath the rafters. "If the other 4 behave like this one." Victoria turned to the finished pieces. That was the real value of White Vale. Not one extraordinary cloak. A process. Wind supplied the force. The earth beneath the tower stripped the grease. Water was used where it mattered instead of wasted by the barrel. By sunset, 5 finished cloaks hung in a row, each close to the same weight, density, and finish. Miles away, one of Blackwood's factors placed a short report on the Duke's desk. Victoria Vance had sold weathercloth without using the river. Blackwood read the line twice. Then he asked for a list of every road, carrier, and wool merchant she would need before the Coastguard bidding closed. The first carrier refused them on Monday. The second refused them before Victoria finished asking. By Tuesday, the wool merchant in Lewis had withdrawn the price he had quoted the week before and claimed every usable bale was already committed. Thomas returned to White Vale with the letter folded in his fist. "He has reached them." Victoria read it once. Blackwood did not need to send threats in his own name. Men who depended on his mills understood what losing his business would cost. The shorter road to the customs depot closed that afternoon. An estate notice appeared at the gate, announcing repairs to a culvert that had carried carts safely all year. Victoria stood beside the notice while the wind pressed her skirt against her boots. "How long by the western road?" she asked. "With a loaded cart?" "Nearly another day." They did not have another day to spare. White Vale was producing cloth reliably now. That made the attack worse, not better. Finished lengths hung from the rafters. Orders existed. Workers were being paid. But cloth that could not reach a buyer was only expensive storage. Victoria went back inside and counted what remained. Wool for 3 more cloaks. Clay enough for 20. Money for perhaps 4 days of wages. She refused to spend any of it fighting Blackwood on ground he controlled. Instead, Thomas rode across the downs to shepherds who sold small lots outside the large mill contracts. Victoria offered cash where she could, and finished cloth where she could not. 2 men agreed first, then 4 more. The wool came in uneven bundles over pack horses, not wagons. That created new problems. Some fleeces carried more grease. Others had been stored poorly. Victoria sorted every lot before it entered the mill and adjusted the fuller's earth by batch instead of forcing all the wool through one fixed recipe. Production slowed. It did not stop. Martha and Elsie worked later as the bidding deadline drew closer. Thomas carried finished cloth over the ridge, by paths too narrow for Blackwood's carts to use. On the 6th evening, Victoria stood beside the turning gears, while a gust struck the sails hard enough to shake chalk from the beams. Thomas reached for the brake. "Keep it running?" Victoria listened to the hammer rhythm. "No. Reef the sail. We lose an hour. We lose everything if the main shaft splits." He obeyed. That choice cost them time, but the mill survived the night. By morning, 7 shepherds were supplying White Vale, and 3 village households were earning wages from its cloth. Blackwood had closed the road. Victoria had built a smaller road around him. Then, after dark, Thomas stepped outside and smelled smoke. A thin orange line was moving through the dry grass below the mill, and the wind was driving it uphill. The fire reached the lower fence before they could beat it back. Thomas and 2 shepherds cut a break through the dry grass, while Victoria carried buckets from the rain barrels, not toward the field, but toward the mill wall and the lowest sail ropes. She could not save the hill. She could save the machine. By midnight, the flames had passed. White Vale still stood. One sail was scorched along its lower edge. A stack of finished cloth near the doorway had taken smoke and drifting ash. 2 lengths were ruined, where sparks had burned through the outer folds. Victoria laid every piece across the floor. Thomas watched her sort them. "Can we clean all of it?" "No." The answer came quickly. They had 1 day before the Coastguard closed bidding. If she washed every smoke-marked length, the rainwater would be gone and the cloth would not dry in time. If she tried to replace the damaged pieces, the mill would need to run through the rising gale with a weakened sail. Victoria separated the worst cloth and set it aside. Then she brushed the ash from the rest while it was dry. Martha and Elsie followed with stiff bristle brushes. Only after the loose soot was gone did Victoria use small amounts of clean water on the sections that needed a final rinse. The cloth was not perfect. It was usable. At dawn, Thomas went down the western track to meet the carrier. He returned alone. He never came. Victoria did not ask why. Blackwood had left her one road, then removed the cart from it. She looked at what remained on the floor. 3 finished samples from separate batches, 1 field-tested cloak, 1 length of raw, greasy wool, and 1 length showing the cloth after fulling. Enough to demonstrate the process. Not enough to look impressive beside a factory shipment. Thomas followed her gaze. "There is another way." He pointed toward the south. A fisherman he knew worked from a cove beyond the cliffs. The sea route to the customs depot was shorter than the western road, but the weather was turning hard. Victoria wrapped the samples in oilcloth. She left the damaged stock behind. She left the cloth that would take hours to rescue. That choice hurt more than losing it. Before sunrise, White Vale's remaining sail turned slowly above the blackened grass, while Victoria climbed into a small fishing boat below the cliffs. She carried no speech for the officials. Only cloth, measurements, witnesses, and one question Blackwood could not close with a gate. Which coat would survive the weather? Victoria reached the customs depot, with salt dried white across her coat, and less than an hour before the winter bidding closed. Blackwood was already there. His sample coats hung beneath the covered quay, dark, smooth, and perfectly finished. Beside them stood 2 packed cases, stamped with the mark of his steam mills. He looked at Victoria's oilcloth bundle. "You brought scraps. I brought samples." The purchasing officer did not ask either of them to explain their reputations. He asked for the coats. 2 Coastguard men put on identical dry inner shirts. One wore Blackwood's machine-woven issue coat. The other wore the White Vale cloak Thomas had tested on the downs. Victoria placed 3 fulled samples from separate mill runs on the inspection table. 3 batches, she said. Same process. Blackwood glanced at them. "And how many hundreds can your hill produce?" The officer raised a hand. "First, we determine whether we want hundreds." A hand pump drew seawater from the harbor. Both men stepped behind a marked line while 2 sailors directed equal streams across their shoulders and chests. 10 seconds. Blackwood's coat darkened almost immediately. 20. Water began running from the cuffs. The White Vale cloth darkened too, but the surface remained dense. Water gathered and rolled away, instead of driving straight through the weave. At 1 minute, the test stopped. The officers opened both coats. The shirt beneath Blackwood's sample was wet across the shoulders and chest. The wool itself had grown heavy enough to sag. The man wearing Victoria's cloak had dampness around the collar where water had entered from above. His chest and back remained dry. The purchasing officer weighed both coats again. Then he asked the petty officer who had tested White Vale cloth on the cliffs to step forward. 3 watches in salt wind, the man said. Same result. It cuts the wind and does not load itself with water as quickly. Victoria said nothing. She did not need to. The officer inspected her 3 production samples, comparing density and finish. No single lucky piece. No demonstration prepared only for that morning. Blackwood's face remained controlled, but his gloved hand tightened around the head of his cane. The purchasing board withdrew for 12 minutes. When they returned, the contract was placed in front of Victoria. White Vale would supply the first winter order, subject to scheduled deliveries and inspection. She signed. Only then did the senior customs officer turn toward Blackwood. There is another matter. He set an older procurement record on the table. We would like an explanation for why cloth from Vance Fulling was removed from approved supply after the government batch your mills later replaced. For the first time that morning, Blackwood had no product left to put between himself and the question. The contract did not make White Vale rich. It made the mill responsible. Victoria returned to the hill with an advance large enough to choose what came first. She paid Martha and Elsie before buying anything for herself. Thomas received wages for the weeks he had worked on credit. Then she ordered proper hornbeam for the gearing, new sailcloth, and enough raw wool to keep the stocks moving without depending on Blackwood's merchants. The Coastguard inspected every delivery. Victoria welcomed it. Each batch was weighed, measured, fulled to the same shrinkage range, rinsed, dried, and checked before cutting. Shepherds who had once sold small lots at whatever price the large mills offered now brought fleece directly to White Vale. Blackwood's losses came more slowly. The winter contract was gone. Then 2 commercial buyers suspended orders after examining the same thin cloth the Coastguard had rejected. Customs auditors reopened the records surrounding the government batch that had destroyed the reputation of Vance Fulling. The inquiry did not leave him ruined overnight. It left him exposed. Within 3 months, Blackwood requested a private meeting. Victoria received him at the old river mill her father had once operated. Its gates were still locked. "You want the lease restored?" he said. "No." He looked at her. "I want the property transferred back, the road restrictions removed, and the finding against my father corrected in the trade record. That is considerably more. So was what you took." There was no anger in her voice. That made the price harder to dismiss. Blackwood had factories full of unsold cloth, creditors asking new questions, and a customs investigation moving through accounts he had once assumed no one would revisit. He signed the transfer 6 days later. Victoria reopened the river mill in spring. She did not abandon White Vale. The river site handled washing, finishing, and the work that truly benefited from abundant water. The hill mill produced the dense weather cloth that had created the business in the first place. 2 systems, neither controlled by Blackwood. By the following autumn, White Vale employed 12 people directly and bought wool from shepherds across the downs. The scorch mark from the fire remained on one sail spar because Victoria refused to replace sound timber merely to make the mill look untouched. One cold evening, she stood beneath the turning gears wearing the first storm cloak she had kept for herself. Outside, a carriage struggled through mud on the lower road. Inside, the camshaft turned. One stalk rose, then the other. Thud, thud, thud. When Blackwood had left her there, the silence of those hammers had been his proof that she was finished. Now Victoria placed her hand against a fresh length of broadcloth and felt the vibration travel through the floor. The mill did not need to prove anything anymore. It was working.